We're sort of the brainchild of the CLAS Council on Diversity and Inclusion. And they decided to have a venue that brought together researchers in a variety of fields that would all talk about the same topic from different sort of disciplinary lenses. And so those were set up largely with a diversity and inclusion theme. And so I talked with Marjorie Levine-Clark, who chairs that council, and those of us that work in the research and creative activities area, so Carol Oxiger and Elizabeth Lee, we proposed the idea of extending that to other research topics. So this is really the first of those to have been held. We're going to have another one of the interdisciplinary exchanges in the spring that also sort of brings together researchers on topics beyond strictly diversity and inclusion, although I bet you hear a little bit of that in some of the discussions we're going to have today. Okay, we're going to follow the same basic approach, which is that we have 3 speakers. They'll each talk for a pretty short time, 10 minutes, maybe 15 minutes. We'll go ahead and run through all 3 of the talks and then open it up to questions that hopefully sort of span the disciplines themselves. I'm excited to have our 3 speakers. I am an economist by training, and I mention that only because I consider myself to be an interdisciplinary researcher. I did a field in demography, which brings together researchers from different disciplines, but my 3 degrees throughout my life are my bachelor's degree in economics and my master's degree in economics and my PhD in economics. And so I don't look quite as interdisciplinary as I might. I'm really impressed by the backgrounds of the people that we have speaking today. So the broad topic today is climate change. The formal name of the program is Climate and Society, Impacts, Interactions, and Interdisciplinary Perspectives. And we're going to hear about research that has its roots in the sciences, in the social sciences, and then beyond that in sort of education and humanities. So it's a nice range of topics. All right, so I'm going to give you a quick introduction to our 3 speakers, and then they'll introduce their topics, and we'll sort of move from one to the other. So our first speaker is going to be Brian Bouma, who came to us from the University of Alaska Anchorage last year, and is now a professor in the Department of Integrative Biology. He got his undergraduate degree in biology with a minor in chemistry, so he's already beat me there. He has a master's degree in science education and a PhD in ecology and evolutionary biology. So sort of interdisciplinary in his own right, and he'll bring those perspectives. He does research on sort of a long-term view of climate change, looking at water and resources and forestation. Our second speaker will be Ivan Ramirez, who has me beat even further. He has a bachelor's degree in environmental studies, a minor in economics, which maybe was one of the requirements for being on the panel, a master's degree in climate and society, PhD in geography with a specialization in ethics and developmental philosophy. Ethics and development in the field of philosophy. He has done some teaching in our Geography and Environmental Sciences department and is currently in Health and Behavioral Science as a visiting assistant professor. He has a wide range of teaching and research experiences, community-engaged study of urban environmental health, climate and disease in Latin America, birth outcomes and residential segregation, to name a few. And our final speaker is Brian Wee, who has been with the college and the university for quite a while. He's a tenured professor in geography and environmental. Okay, not as long as me. I could say he's the senior member of the group, but Brian has his bachelor's degree in economics, his master's in conservation biology, his PhD in science education. So, let's see. In addition to some research that he's done with some interdisciplinary teams that are looking at science education and curriculum around learning assistance and STEM clubs and a variety of things with external funding, Brian's working on a book project about children's sense of place across cultures, and another project using story maps to understand how children view urban development in marginalized communities. So with that, away you go, Brian.
Okay, thanks. So today I figured I'd show you a bit about my research in Southeast Alaska. So I'm actually from Juneau, not Anchorage, which is in the middle of Southeast Alaska, and I work on a variety of things related to forest health and climate change. So just so you know where I'm talking about, Southeast Alaska is up there, Seattle's down in this part of the world, Vancouver, BC. It's actually quite large. Most people think it's a small park because it's a fraction of the state, but it's actually the size of Florida. And the coast below it, which you'll also see, is another size of Florida. So we'll be talking about an area that's twice the size of Florida. And today I wanted to show you how climate is affecting the forests up there, but in a variety of different ways. So rather than dive deep into a particular study, I'll show you a whole bunch of interrelated things, because there's a lot of winners and losers up in the north as far as climate change goes. Certainly it's warming very rapidly up there, much more rapidly than down here. And many things are dying off and having problems, but many things are doing quite well also. So it's sort of a complex story. Now the backdrop for this is this phenomenon called yellow cedar decline. So this is somewhere near Sitka, if you've ever been up there. It's kind of on the outer coast. That's a lot of dead trees. This is all that white you see is dead, and you can see in the background there's what we call a bathtub ring. There's a lot of white sort of at low elevations in the back. This is caused directly by climate change. It's caused by the lack of snow. So it snowed this morning here, which is great. Imagine up in Alaska it used to snow all the time. It doesn't snow anymore, especially at low elevations. It just rains. It's not like it's drier, it's just warmer. As a result, when you do get the occasional cold snap, which you're not as cold as here because you're on the ocean, but when you do get the occasional cold snap, the ground freezes, and that kills these trees really quick. So we have a big, big swath of land that's just dead. The live trees you see are not yellow cedar. Up until last week, there was an endangered species petition for this species, which was just turned down by the federal government. So it's not an endangered species officially, but it is dying very, very quickly. Let me go back. And wherever you go, you see pretty big spots like this. Whole islands are dead. And it's surprisingly, or unsurprisingly, it's spreading as the climate warms. So this is Southeast Alaska, that's Canada. Orange is the range of the cedar. Blue is the range of the mortality there. And as the climate warms, this thing will continue to die off. This is about 7% of the range. We're expecting to see about 50% of the range dead within the next 50 years or so. Kind of depends on the warming scenarios and where things die. There's still a lot we don't know about it. But we should see this mortality spread actually south as the climate warms up, hitting Washington fairly soon, Oregon, and then there's a teeny bit in California in the range. So far we've lost about 4,000 square kilometers, which is 7% of the total range. But I want to talk about, for the purposes of this interdisciplinary perspective, 4 things related to this mortality. So this is sort of the background. We'll talk about 4 things going forward. So a lot of stuff's dying, but a lot of stuff's growing too. You see all those dead trees, right? But oddly enough, the forest is not going away. In fact, the forest is growing. The forest is gaining biomass. These are spruce trees. These aren't yellow cedar. These will grow to be 1 or 2 meters across, so 3 to 6 feet across up there. They get very, very large. And they're growing quickly. As those trees die, as those yellow cedar die, so all these things die, there is a period where it looks really bad, but then other species come back and they grow actually faster than the cedar did. So the climate's warming up, there's less freezing, actually the growing season is expanding, and we're seeing a much bigger, denser forest than we used to. It's less diverse, you've lost this key species. And yellow cedar is really interesting in terms of its role for actually bat habitat, but also chemistry. It changes the chemistry of the soil, which changes the diversity of the understory, like the flowers and berries and things. But net, we're seeing increase in biomass. And again, that's a result of losing one species, but essentially giving more light and more resources for the remaining species. So biomass is going up quite a bit, actually about a teragram a year, which is actually a very large number in large live trees, which is a big amount of biomass. This is a plot here of forest change as a function of latitude, so south to north. And this is just the number of basically patches of areas that have grown or shrunk. Of course, there's always trees dying, in the north. Things blow over, landslides happen. That's the red lines. The green lines are areas where the forest has either come back or expanded. And what you see is, especially in the northern half of that area, we've got way more expansion than we have decline. And this is an interesting opportunity. This is a lot of biomass. It's a huge amount. It's the area the size of Florida. And if you count coastal BC, it's 2 Floridas, where there's hardly anybody living there. So in that whole area, there's about 70,000 people total. So there's nobody there. And it's growing. So you've lost a species, but it's growing. So carbon markets, from the economic side, carbon markets are becoming important. People are planting trees or refraining from harvest as a way to sell carbon credits on the California Carbon Exchange and a variety of other carbon exchange mechanisms. Up there, especially the tribal governments, so the tribes own a ton of land in Southeast Alaska. They're turning to this as an income generator. So as there is continued push against logging of old growth forests, recently there has been some rollbacks of regulations, as you'd expect, regarding harvesting of old growth forests, but there's still societal pressure not to harvest old growth forests. So they see this growth in the forest as an opportunity to market their wood on the carbon exchange. So big swaths of southeast and moving up into sort of more coastal central Alaska have been set aside for carbon preservation values, which is kind of cool. We recently conducted a study on this, you probably can't read that, trying to determine how much money people would make, these loggers, because many of the loggers down there are sort of small scale mom and pop organizations, how much money they would make simply harvesting the dead yellow cedar, because yellow cedar is a very valuable wood. It stays good for a while after it's dead. And they're going to cut something anyway, so we tried that. And they're actually starting to make money doing that instead of harvesting live yellow cedar. So there's this, it's an interesting story because there's so few people up there. As a scientist, you're really stuck into this stew of interest. You can't just work with other scientists because you're the only one. So you end up having to work with the loggers, and they're going to cut something. So you have to figure out how to accomplish your conservation goals, if you have them, your scientific goals, while still working with them. And they have their economic needs. They have to make money to live. Now there's also a cultural side to this as well. These are a couple culturally modified trees. So as cedar declines, there's a loss of this resource from a cultural and artistic point of view. So cedar, I grew up in the Northwest where we had red cedar, which is what this species is. And every year in school we'd learn about how people would use red cedar the same way bison were used. Every part of this tree was valuable, especially the bark. So this is a yellow cedar that's still alive, that's being harvested for bark. So the bark would be harvested, it's harvested in the spring, it's pounded and then soaked in water, and it's woven into clothes, into hats. You can actually weave it into watertight baskets, which is pretty cool. So we've been also looking at the ecological impacts of climate change on these practices. Because when you do this, it doesn't really kill the tree. This would be about as much as you take from this given tree. And it will heal. This is a peeling done from probably about 80 years ago. We didn't core it, so it's hard to tell. But it was no doubt about as wide as that, and now it's about as wide as my finger. It's heals over. They heal over from the sides, and then you can harvest them again. So the decline of yellow cedar is a problem because there's less bark to heal, basically. But interestingly enough, as the climate warms and that forest expands, other species are taking over. So red cedar, which is a more southerly species, is migrating north. So this is actually the northernmost cedar in the world, red cedar in the world. This stand, there's like 5 of them there. People have been harvesting them for a long time, but this species is moving north, and now tribes are talking about how they're going to switch their artistic practices over. And we're working with them to see if, or to design plantings and ecological treatments for the conservation of these trees that work with their needs artistically as well. So places where you can harvest yellow cedar for their wood projects or for bark that isn't going to threaten the survival of the species, basically, in certain areas. So there's a whole bunch of angles to this story that are really interesting from an ecological point of view, but they do spread out across disciplines. The economics and working with the economic needs of small communities while not disrupting the ecology, the cultural side, the carbon credit side in the future, and then just the basic sort of natural world side of things. The last thing, of course, that's always a challenge is communicating this sort of decline to people. So I want to show you this really neat thing that was done in closing, because it should give you another sense of how the forest is changing in an entirely different way. So what you're going to hear is data. This is audio. This is real plot data put to sound. It's audification. That's not a good, I was going to say for lack of a better term. It's a pretty bad term. This is plot data that extends from healthy yellow cedar forests to dead yellow cedar forests to those growing forests, which are getting bigger now, but without much cedar in it. I mean, there's still a little bit around. So what you're going to hear is a bunch of notes, and the notes correspond to trees. Every note is an individual tree moving along about an 80-mile transect. If you hear piano, it's yellow cedar. If you hear flute, it's western hemlock, which is a very, very common tree that's doing quite well. Clarinet is pine. Shore pine is just lodgepole pine, same as here. Violin, cellos are hemlock and spruce, respectively. The volume is the size of the tree. And so this is what it sounds like. Briefly. Okay. Oh, crap. Sorry. I just wanted to pause it for a minute. So that's what you'll hear. Every little note is a tree. And so what you're going to hear is, as you move south, you're going to hear the piano slowly start to drop out. And then there'll be a kind of a gap where there's not a lot that's alive. But then you'll hear the forest coming back in the form of flutes. It's very, very relaxing as well. It's about 3 minutes long. that was it. And there's no composing there. That's the pitch is the height of the tree. The sustain is the health of the tree, the canopy size. If you want more information on it, the link is right there. But yeah, it was pretty neat. I mean, you can hear the transition. All those plots should have been nothing but piano, 50 years ago. But they're not. Sorry. All right. So that's it. If you want a copy of the presentation, it's got that link on it. That's a link there. So thanks.
Great, thank you. Okay, so Tracy, thanks to Tracy both for lunch and all of the tech support.
Such as it is.
She's been great. So our second speaker is Ivan Ramirez.
Nice break.
Oops. My computer's thinking.
Good for communication.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for inviting me. This is the Interdisciplinary Exchange on Climate and Society is very interesting to me. It's something I'm passionate about. I'm not going to discuss any specific research. It's more about an approach to capacity building, which has applications for research, but it's predominantly been used in the context of institutional building. It's been governments, multilateral organizations, master's program, undergraduate courses. A lot of research actually has helped contribute to the approach over 30 years now. And we can think of it more broadly in different scales, at the national level, at the state level, at the regional level within the state, and at the community level as well. So I'd like to just kind of present this sort of interdisciplinary, cross-system approach to thinking about climate change in society, but really what we do with this approach is we're really thinking about climate and society. Climate change is one aspect of it that's very important and center at the moment, but climate affects us in many different ways and at many different scales and across many different sectors. So this is my presentation outline. What is a climate affairs approach? Why the need for it, and many of you probably know that. Why we need some sort of cross-systems approach. The components of the approach, briefly. In closing, a question that I usually raise to students, or something that is kind of weaved throughout research or a lot of different projects is, do we have problem climates or society the problem? And lastly, if I can get to it, some applications. So what is climate affairs? It's multidisciplinary, it's also interdisciplinary, so you can be who you are and you can also collaborate, or you can integrate across disciplines. It's cross systems because all sectors are affected, right? And when we have an environmental problem, it's also a social problem, and it cuts across many different themes and sectors of society. It's flexible and adaptive. It's not a scientific method, so it's an approach. And its origins are from work that started in the mid-1970s and the Environmental and Societal Impacts Group at NCAR. I don't know if it still exists there or not, led by Michael Glantz or Mickey Glantz, working on, Mickey Glantz is a political scientist, so working with atmospheric scientists and with social scientists and various disciplines within the environmental scientists, looking at, for example, one of the first projects was looking at civil conflict and drought in Africa at a time when there were Portuguese colonies, and so it was kind of very interesting. And then moving on to fisheries in Latin America and looking at water resources out here in Colorado. The Institute now is at CU Boulder, the Consortium for Capacity Building through INSTAR. So the components of it are very, I think, very simple and straightforward. Climate science inherently is a very important aspect of it, but we'd like to extend beyond that and kind of think of other ways of knowing too about climate. So knowledge, right, where we can incorporate things like traditional, local, and ordinary knowledge. ecosystem and societal impacts, and bidirections or interactions, which I'll spend a little bit of time on. Climate economics, climate policy, and then you can also break it up into climate politics and law. Climate politics and then climate policy and law. And lastly, climate ethics and equity, which actually I would underscore and say that that's a very important part of this. Motivating, I think, the approach and the work. And for me, it's very exciting. I always really like to focus on these parts whenever I can. Most of it's been in terms of teaching, less so in terms of research, but I'd really like to start expanding that. This is a diagram that I use. It's just a heuristic model, very oversimplified. You can conceive this in many different ways, and it's complementary to other approaches because there are many sort of interdisciplinary approaches out there, looking at intersections between climate, environment. Here I kind of describe it as ecosystems. I mean, different kinds of ecosystems, but it could also be an urban ecosystem, a rural ecosystem, or the intersection of the two. Crossing boundaries, different aspects of society, public health, infrastructure, energy. I mean, you can name a number of different sectors. Scale, from global to regional to place. Vulnerability and the conception of thinking about exposures to climate hazards. Sensitivity of the population of ecosystems, and also resilience of those systems and their responses to changes, including hazards. And different kinds of scales, including here we've got intraseasonal and interannual every few years, but we can think about long-term or multi-decadal as well, changes. Why the need? Environmental and social problems are multidimensional, which calls for multidimensional or multidisciplinary skills and thinking about problems. Environmental problems do not respect borders. They're cross-cutting themes, food, energy, and water nexus, among others. They're intersectoral. We don't not only need the meteorological services or the National Weather Service to work with public health, for example, but they also have to work with the census or the water and infrastructure sectors or energy. Inherently, climate science is a very important aspect of it, looking at dynamics and energy balance of the planet, the greenhouse effect, and these are just a few. You could have many. Right? This is really thinking about how we know what we know. Greenhouse gas emissions from the 60s to the present, the Keeling's curve, and also very important, and something that maybe doesn't often come up, is also regional science as well. This is very important. Here's an example looking at the El Nino phenomenon, which stems from the tropical Pacific Ocean. And the Peruvians, as well as the Australians, and others, including the US, have their own set of indicators, and sometimes they conflict with their interpretation of what's occurring in the tropical Pacific Ocean. And that's a very important aspect to kind of consider. Look, there's regional understandings as well, and we have to kind of sort of contextualize when we're thinking about understanding or examining a problem as well, and considering those regional partners as well. Climate knowledge, which is a lot of fun, and I've had some experience more in the context of teaching, but also when I'm out in the field, thinking about traditional, ordinary, and local knowledge, and cultural aspects of it, other ways of knowing. Here, mostly examples from Africa and Latin America. Here's a rain dance in Uganda. Here is, I think that's a magpie, you can correct me, in Burkina Faso, where we use signals in nature to kind of identify, rather than using computers, to kind of signal when the rainy season might be coming or when it might be ending. Constellations that have been used by the Incas to forecast and to plan the planting of potatoes, for example, using the constellations as signals of when to do that. And as well as locals discussing and having their forums, like weather forecasting forums, but where they're not necessarily using instrumentation, they're discussing local knowledge, but now, because the system is much more variable, some of their knowledge is not as useful as it once was, so now they're working with with scientists, combining instrumentation with traditional and ordinary knowledge. Climate impacts or climate interactions on environment and society could be thought of as one direction, and there's many different ways to conceive that. Looking at floods, droughts, epidemics, heat waves, and this is how we might tend, or we're thinking from a government perspective, we tend to think about climate and climate change from a hazards perspective, right? And this is about thinking about our perspectives of climate as a hazard, but also as a resource, right? And if we can manage our hazards, we might be able to convert those hazards to avoid, mitigate, and even prevent any kind of detrimental effects on society and ecosystems, and we can possibly turn those into opportunities as well. Sorry for blocking you. And the other way around is societal impacts on environment and climate, and different kinds of human activities. Dam construction, deforestation, urbanization, agriculture, automobiles, industrial pollution, anthropogenic changes caused by human activities which have impacts on ecosystems and biodiversity, which also then has a feedback into not only regional climate but also the global climate system. And mind you that the climate environment society pathways occurring at the same time that the societal impacts are occurring, and it's sort of this loop that's occurring. Thinking about economics, and there's many different ways. We can just take from the discipline and start applying many different concepts, from discounting to other aspects. Here I just focus on a few things, thinking about just damages and costs from extreme weather and from a changing climate. Here's the top 5 costliest hurricanes on record according to NOAA. A very interesting topic which incorporates both economics and politics and political economy is Arctic politics, right? A changing climate in the Arctic, which is ground zero. These are actually military facilities, and many different countries where those military facilities belong to, and thinking about territorial claims to the Arctic as the Arctic is changing, and there's opportunities that are thought of in terms of shipping routes and also extraction of oil. So there's this competition. And lastly, just to kind of maybe remind us or just kind of think about that, we've been talking about political aspects of climate for a very long time now. This is an article from Nature in 1979, which describes a lot of the things that we talk about today. Unfortunately, the same problems or the same view, right? Political view of CO2. And those politics can then transform into some kind of policy and law, and there's many very interesting examples to kind of think about. Just here within the US, thinking about the EPA and air pollution and the Clean Air Acts, and thinking more broadly in terms of a global climate accord, which could influence policy. It's not specifically a policy, but it could influence policy and provide mechanisms and mechanisms to help address global climate change. And lastly, climate ethics and equity, where you can kind of integrate, everything really can be integrated. Questions about decision making, and thinking about equitable outcomes, disproportionate impacts, thinking about, the last example is very interesting, climate, economic, famines, climate, and colonialism. And it's a really interesting book by Mike Davis, which really takes these famines that were once blamed on climate and then puts it in the context of colonialism in terms of the British Empire. And really interesting questions come up. You know, who's responsible for climate, and is there a climate debt? And lastly, in closing, a question that I usually bring up is there problem climates or problem societies? Here's a very good example, the degradation of the Aral Sea, which has been occurring since the 1950s, associated with Soviet policies, to say the least. And lastly, just some applications. Master's program at Columbia, capacity building workshops, many, probably about 100 or so all over the world. and research. This is the current project that we have at CCB, El Nino Ready Nations, that focuses on disaster risk reduction, and we're also looking how to integrate that into climate change adaptation strategies as well. Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
This is how I took a full page the last time. Why my computer's taking so long this time, I do not know.
It's okay.
This one?
And then, I can use that to
You
scroll.
can drive that way? Yeah,
Or,
either way,
are you gonna do it
either way.
this way?
I don't know if the touchpad will do it. Oh, there you go.
Okay, awesome, thanks. Hi everybody, my name is Brian. I'm going to be talking about society and climate, particularly the relationships between how people look at climate change, how they think about it. And I picked this picture because it's an image last week of Greta Thunberg, the youth activist from Sweden who's taken the world by storm, addressing a crowd in Edmonton, Canada. And at the same time that she's enthralling the crowds, this report was talking about how murals of Greta were being defaced in Edmonton at the same time. And so there are all these sort of different ways by which people think about and make sense of climate change. And that's sort of what I'm drawn to, is how people make sense of environmental phenomena. And that's going to be the focus of my talk today. So the key thing that I sort of think about and want to help us think about is that we live in a visual culture. Jillian Rose mentions that we organize human space based on how we see things. And so when we say we see something, or when I say I see climate change, it's not just what my eyes see, but how I make sense of what I'm seeing. And Yi Fu Tuan gives a great example. He says if you have an Uber driver in Denver versus somebody who's visiting Denver for a conference, both individuals might see the same city, but take something different away from it, or have a different meaning or connection to the city of Denver. And so that's where my work sort of resides, is in these, trying to understand what these meanings are, to understand meanings so that we can better contemplate and think about human-environment relationships. And I do that primarily through drawing. So I'm going to share with you two sets of drawings today. One is a set of children's drawings of the environment from Stockholm, Sweden. And another set of drawings is from women in South India talking about fieldwood collection. And then I'll connect those two back to climate change. So the first project I'm going to talk about here is, oh, why is this? Hang on, maybe I should use, there we go. Okay, so the first project I'm going to talk about is actually based on the research fellowship that I received working with Stockholm University in Sweden, and I was there for my sabbatical. I really, really miss it. Not so much Sweden, but just having sabbatical, I think. I'm very much looking forward to the next one. But what it did do is it gave me a chance to work with children there. And that's coming out, that work is going to be out in a book contract with Routledge in April of next year. But this is the dominant narrative around what children know. We tend to focus a lot more on what they know, particularly in school systems, where it's really about testing, it's really about knowledge. Much more so that's the emphasis, rather than how children come to know. And I'm drawn to questions around why. Why is it that someone thinks about climate change in this particular way, or set of ways? And that's sort of driving a lot of this, my research, but in particular this project. So what I did was, I asked children in Stockholm to please draw a picture of what you think the environment looks like in the future. And these are just, I'm going to show you two sample drawings from them. They were aged 12 years, and they were drawn from two science classes in this particular school, middle school in Stockholm. But this is a very sort of prototypical drawing that I've seen not only in children from Sweden, where this study was done, but children in China, in the US, and Singapore, which are also countries where I've asked them to draw the same thing. And what's fascinating is not only sort of the emphasis on negative, large-scale human impacts, but you actually have sort of explicitly children relating environmental futures to, in this case, global warming. There is a particular sense of dread or doom, based on this drawing alone. There's deforestation. Someone's got a huge saw. There's a lot of traffic, and I suspect this refers to sort of smokestacks, industrial activity, urbanization and development. And when I asked, so I didn't present this, but we interviewed all of these children as well. And when I asked them, what should we do about this scenario? Their response is, well, we don't know because we're going to leave it to the adults. Adults know more than us. They're going to tell us what we need to do. And I asked them, so what adults are you referring to? And in Sweden, it's interesting, they say, we need to leave it to scientists and to the government to solve this problem, which I find fascinating as well, because in the US, I don't think we would see them talking about the government in the same way. Thanks. So here's another picture. This is a little bit more straightforward in the sense that maybe you have a bear. This you can't read it very well, but it's a glacier. So you have a bear in the glacier that is receding, and what's happening is, it says vatten, which is water. Stockholm is basically underwater in the future due to climate change. So this is, again, sort of depicting some of these prototypical narratives around climate change. And the question, what I found then is basically, can't screw it up here. Is there a way to?
You up
There we
and
go.
down. Yeah.
I think we did. Thanks, Tracy. Basically, what we're looking at here is children's drawings representing both the content, what is in the drawing, as well as these cultural codes that shape what they expect the environment to look like in the future. And here's what I find particularly interesting, is that Stuart Aiken mentions what children are thinking about is actually a process of socialization. Children think about climate change in a way, in these particular ways, because they have been socialized to think about them that way, through different venues, schools, playgrounds, families, social media. But if you think about their drawings, these are actually representations not only of what children are thinking, but of what we are thinking as well. By we, I mean the folks who create the school curriculums, who create the venues for social media, for film, television, and so on and so forth. So that's a particular discourse I'll come back to in just a bit. The second thing I want to share with you, moving from children's drawings, is to women's drawings of field collection. And this is a research project with Gregory Simon in our department, Deepti Chatty, who's at Humboldt State, and Emily Anderson over at the USGS. And basically, is grounded in the idea that right now, as a way to address climate change, there are development projects out there replacing wood-burning stoves with clean cook stoves to reduce carbon emissions. And this is the dominant narrative because it's sort of a top-down developmental model. We'll come into your village and we'll address this issue of climate change by bringing in this new technology. And what the authors here have argued is that there's been too little attention given to how women in particular understand and engage in this process of fieldwood collection. Because in a lot of societies that rely on wood, it's really the women who end up collecting that fuel to engage in cooking activities, for example. So what this group did was they asked women in South India, in 2 villages, to please make a map of your fieldwood collection route. And these were taken from 2 villages in South India, Andhra Pradesh and Karnataka. And this is what the women drew. This is one of them. We believe this is a sort of a self-portrait. The woman drawing herself in the middle of that picture. This is the house and the trail that she takes to collect fieldwood. But what's important here is the fact that she's centered in this drawing with the sense of, I can do this. I'm actually able to provide for my family, for my community, through the activity of fieldwood collection. This is another example of a drawing that highlights how fieldwood collection really doesn't happen alone. You have multiple individuals going out with to collect fieldwood, they put it on their head, and there are these different landscapes that they move through. There's the house, there's the agricultural field, there's a forest in the back, but this is sort of counterintuitive to many of these development projects, because what happens is, as we talk to these women, we begin to understand that their meanings associated with fieldwood collection is more about empowerment and social activity. They actually said, you know, when we go out to collect fieldwood, we get time to gossip, we get time to interact with each other. And there are these elements that cannot be measured quantitatively when we're talking about reducing carbon emissions. It's not just about putting in clean cook stoves and taking out wood-burning stoves. It's also about the impact on people's lives, particularly in this case, women's lives. So, what does this mean? Basically, the implications are that if we're not aware of these dominant narratives, we're not really paying attention to how they regulate the ways by which we think and the ways by which we implement climate policies, for example. So what we're talking about here is basically potentially discourses on climate change being counterproductive. So if children are seeing the environmental future as being sort of a mess, that we're all doomed, it can lead to a sense of helplessness. If I can't do anything, then what's the point of trying, for example? There's also the idea that if we think of climate mitigation, carbon mitigation as simply replacing wood-burning stoves, we might be disempowering women who participate in the activity of fieldwood collection. So, some things we could do to address it are to maybe think about presenting different representations of climate change. Can we talk about adaptation as well as mitigation? And ultimately, can we involve more people using different methods in decision-making vis-a-vis climate change? And that's currently my research project is to look at how children, childhood, and environment are represented on social media, specifically Instagram. And I'm going to see if I can pull this up. So this is, I hope it pulls up here, but a way to think about how parents and children and families are thinking about outdoor activities, particularly around the idea that if we get children into nature, they become, this becomes an opportunity to redirect the idea that the environmental future that we're doomed, essentially. That this is perhaps one avenue by which we encourage change vis-a-vis climate change. So that's it.
Thank
Thank you.
Lunch, and it's nice and warm on a cold day, and we'll get to that. But we have time for a few questions. John?
So thinking about your talk, Brian, I want to see.
Right. I'm sorry.
Sorry.
One of the things that I've been noticing over the last decade is sort of a change in how opponents of doing anything about climate change talk about climate change. Like a decade ago, it's like, we don't know, the science isn't settled, we need more data, and you know, there's a sort of disinformation about what was going on. And it seems like in the last couple of years, I'm seeing more arguments along the sort of helplessness, there's nothing we can do about it, so we might as well not do anything about it, because there's nothing we can do. We're already past the point of no return, so therefore, let's just keep doing. And I was wondering whether you're noticing the same things, and how that plays into the consciousness of people, young people in particular, but anybody thinking about taking action on climate change.
That's a good point. I think one of the challenges is that, at least with the children that I've worked with in these different countries, they envision climate change as being something that's beyond them. It's happening not here, but far away. And so it's not so much that they don't care about it. There's a sense, again, the sense of helplessness is perhaps the idea that maybe the ways by which we present climate change portray it as something so global that the local and the regional aspect of it is lost.
Right, but what I'm trying to say is like the adults in the room are now taking that same sense of there's nothing we can do about it because it's so global and it's going to cost us so much money. Whereas a decade ago it was like, we don't need to do anything because we don't know whether it's really the thing. And now we're saying we don't need to do anything because we're already past the point of no return, so we can't do anything anyway. We might as well just let it roll out and do whatever it is that it does.
And I think that's where the onus is on us as people, as adults particularly, and this is part of what my work is trying to do, is to say that when we look at children, and a lot of times people say, well, that's the next wave of change. They're the generation who are going to be the problem solvers. It's really not just about the next generation, it's about our generation, it's about us. What are we doing? Maybe we can shift the discourse. Maybe there's a way to push agendas in ways that promote more of this activism. Perhaps that's what Greta Thunberg is trying to do as well. It's a great point. I know, yeah.
No, I was just gonna follow up a little bit. Have you collected artwork from kids over a long period of time, or is this a pretty recent? Because it'd be interesting to see if there are differences, right?
Yeah.
In what they, I mean, I agree, the conversation seems different to me. It'd be interesting to see if kids were, internalizing all of that.
So I've done this with different children at different points in time. So I haven't followed the same group longitudinally, but what I've seen over time is the same sets of patterns emerging in the drawings, albeit from different places. Yeah.
I was just curious if you could tell us what the main sort of distinctions between what comes out of the drawings in different places. I mean, you mentioned attitudes about government and in Sweden. Are there any other differences that strike you?
Children in Sweden are far more reliant on the government, not surprisingly. It's a very much of a much more of a socialist sort of paradigm. In China, children have their drawings tend to always have some element of urban infrastructure present. Not surprisingly, because many cities where I worked in, it's just China is urbanizing so quickly. In the US, what's interesting is you tend to see much more natural processes being affected. So deforestation, fish dying in the lake, but much less sort of the idea of human environment interactions taking place. In Singapore, it's Singapore. I'm from Singapore, so I'm smiling. The children there tend to talk about racial issues, actually, as a component of climate change. Talking about how people who live in particular parts of the city or the island might be affected potentially differently, or might have different responses to climate change. The same thing in Stockholm. When I did the study, there was a wave of immigrants from Syria, refugees actually, and they brought up in the interviews how they were worried about this influx of immigrants into Sweden and how the government was going to deal with that as well. So I think part of what happens in these drawings is there's a heightened consciousness in relation to current events in these places too.
The question, so the music created by Professor Bruno is just so beautiful. I enjoy it so much, and then so I was wondering. So the flute, right, represents the trees that I forgot which one, but so I was wondering, like, so the data we have is for the past, but like, do you analyze it? Do you analyze and predict what's going to happen when the weather gets warmer? Because the biomass is actually getting bigger, right? Just for that region. So the two questions. So in the future, do you predict like how much it will get warmer, and then what the biomass will look like in that region? And the other question is, globally, like when the climate change has someone done the research on in total, the biomass, is it getting bigger or is it shrinking? So those are the questions.
Yeah, that's the thing with, so in that area, it is getting bigger, certainly as it warms up. You can look at the globe as well. So as the climate warms up, especially areas that are currently, we call them cold, temperature limited or energy limited, are probably going to gain biomass. So that's large portions of the world, coastal areas, many coastal areas I should say. High latitude areas often gain quite a bit of biomass as growing season gets longer. Other areas will not. It depends on like precipitation, for example. So areas around here will probably lose biomass as it gets warmer. Even if precipitation doesn't change all that much, it'll get drier effectively. On the whole, we don't necessarily have a particularly good idea on that. I think in general, biomass is expected to go up a little bit on the whole, but it'll certainly drop in some areas and go up in others. That doesn't mean carbon will go down, of course. We're losing carbon from a variety of other areas, permafrost, the oceans, that sort of stuff. So, but there's definitely winners and losers, and I just think that's a particularly good location to look at winners and losers, ecologically and economically, and well, the socio-ecological sort of network. There's many places which will gain biomass, but almost all of them will lose diversity at the same time, as certain species do better at the expense of others in the future climate. A great example is boreal Canada. So one of the largest biome in the world, in many places is growing a lot faster than it used to. There's still some concern about whether water supplies will keep pace with the speed at which the plants want to grow. But in Canada, large parts of Canada, they're growing quite a bit faster. But only certain species are doing that. Other ones are not doing so hot because they just can't keep pace, which is kind of similar to there.
All right, I'll follow up on that a little bit. So I was at the talk last night about reintroducing wolves, and part of what they were talking about was the balance of different species, right, changes. And so you talked some about which vegetation is replacing which. Does it have an effect on wildlife? Is there a particularly symbiotic sort of?
Yeah, could in places. Yeah, I was at the talk too. In this part of the world, not too much. That's not to say not anywhere else. In the southeast part of the world, as those things change, the wildlife is really giant bears and wolves and deer. So they're sort of like large organisms that they can adapt, and they do sort of adapt fine. So in that part of the world, no, not too much as far as wildlife goes. Elsewhere though, I mean like the big effects on climate change, there are big effects, of climate change on those things. I mean, ecology is a study of relationships, so this is sort of something our field is focused a lot on. Things like if your plant goes extinct and you're a specialist pollinator, that's the end of it. Or if the pollinator goes extinct, that's the end of it for the plant. Chytrid fungus in Latin America is decimating amphibians, and that's related to warming. So there's all sorts of problems. But no, here we can't really blame too much on wildlife. There's all sorts of human problems with wildlife up there related to wolves. But we can't blame it on climate change in that case.
Yeah, it strikes me I always think of scientists as having it easier, but of course we all do outside of our world, but that, you can have sort of a controlled experiment. But this is similarly a whole bunch of interactive things and trying to figure out which is causing, which is probably
it's kind of, it's pretty hard because you can't conduct experiments at the scale we want knowledge at. And so there's definitely a lot of, we call them natural experiments. So that is a great example of a natural experiment where you just remove one species but leave everything else and then see what happens. But you definitely have to try and tease apart what's specific to that region, what's specific elsewhere, what's the human component, etc.
Okay, I have one last one, not to get Ivan off scot-free. So I thought it was sort of interesting, though. Your talk pulled together a whole bunch of things that I think everybody kind of pulled together, right? Having this systems approach, or how so much is interrelated. And so I have a few questions that come from that, but I'll stick to one, and that is, it was really interesting to me the way that people sort of culturally gathered the information that they needed, right? And that we all think, oh, science will tell us the answer to these things, but that people come up with sort of culturally traditional ways to gather information. So the, planting season from the stars, I guess I get that's seasonal. Birds giving information about rain coming, are those
Well-
good indicators? Like, has
You know
anybody
what's kind of
looked at-
interesting is that, and you can look at this in many different ways, there's scientists that come in and they want to test, like for example with the constellations, they're, through oral history, we read about the Incas using the stars to plant potatoes, and so some scientists over at Columbia and an anthropologist who's now at Columbia, was at UC Davis, was wondering, let's try to answer this question. Let's see if there's any credit. And it is where I mean, raises flags, but raises flags because it says, is their knowledge credible?
Right.
They've been using it for hundreds of years, and let's see if there's something to this. And so they gathered, put together some data, and actually what they were looking, because in the Andes is where this is taking place, and one of the most important phenomena is looking at the tropical Pacific Ocean, the El Nino phenomena. So they ran some analysis, some models, and then they also did some correspondence with potatoes and with measurements, and then what they discovered is that they were able to predict using, is it the Pleiades constellation? When there were too many clouds in the sky, you weren't able to see the constellations. And what that actually signals is that, hey, there's actually a lot of moisture coming from the western Pacific to the eastern Pacific because there's an El Nino forming. And when that happens, the constellations are clouded. And it means that when we see that, we know that rains are coming. And so, we need to plant. But if we see that in a particular time of year, right? I think maybe it would have been probably in their summer or so. And if they happen to see that the sky's clear in a particular year, then they might think, or depending on when that occurrence takes place, it might suggest that we're going to actually have a dry year. It's either going to be a normal year, or it's going to be very dry in the highlands. And they tested this. So that's one example with the potatoes. With the birds, it's just observations that people see. They're tied to the environment. They see different trees blossoming, flowers, and they might observe that some birds tend to migrate at particular times. Without instrumentation, they can say, okay, I think the rains are coming. But they can even be more precise to some extent. Like in Burkina Faso, the multidisciplinary team working with local farmers there, doing some studies, they found out that when the first rains come, people stick their hands in, or the farmers will stick their fingers or their hands, I guess it depends the size of your hand, in the mud, and depending on how deep it goes will tell them, if there's going to be good rains or not, right? And based on that, they'll make some kind of decision to plant, and what's very interesting is they might plant what they typically might plant. It might be sorghum or something, some other subsistence crop. Or they might think, and this is where we're still, again, it's many years now, we're still trying to figure out, are they using the information, what are they doing with it? They might change to a different crop that is more drought resistant or so. And so it's kind of interesting. And so there's a lot of different things that you can find in nature. I mean, there was an article that came out a few years ago about, using elephants to predict rain, right? Tracking the elephants, I think with GPS units or something, and realizing that they follow the water and that they can detect when there's thunder many miles away, and using that to kind of, well, there you need some instrumentation, and I'm not exactly sure the locals might use that information, but there's a lot of integration going on now in terms of this cultural or local knowledge, traditional knowledge with the scientific, which is very important, and in many ways it highlights the importance of local. I mean, scientists don't live there or grow up, and even thinking about here in the city, if we're doing a study, we need to speak to the local community and ask them where the hazards are or how they're experiencing different kinds of phenomena, and only they can really inform us of what they experience because we don't live there.
Okay, so
Can I-
I invite
can I-
everybody to grab some lunch, and we have time to talk informally, right?
Can I add something real quick?
Sure.
Sorry,
If any of you need to leave
Yeah.
soon, feel free to go ahead and get started.
I just think it's really interesting because that's what we didn't see in children's drawings was the sort of cultural and indigenous perspective. The children in Sweden, there's a huge indigenous population of Sami that live north of Stockholm, and we were expecting hopefully to see them talking about the implications of climate change on reindeer populations that the Sami really depend on. But that never came out, despite the fact that it showed up in this national Swedish curriculum as being a component of their education. And so I wonder where that disconnect is, because it's there as you're describing, Ivan, but it's suddenly there are elements of it that just don't show up in children's sort of perceptions of the human environment sort of connection. So I think it's really fascinating.
I could actually build on that a little bit too.
Yeah.
Real quick. Only because the cedar is such, that particular case study is such a culturally important species. But the indigenous communities there may not have the same response to climate change you might expect, all of them. Some of them are quite concerned if they're up on current knowledge, but many will say, oh, we've seen climate change before. You know, they have oral histories going back to the Little Ice Age up there, which caused glaciers to expand by 80 kilometers in places. Like, oh yeah, we've seen trees die back before, we'll find something else to work with. Because we've had to do that before. Not all of them, by any stretch of the imagination, but I was always surprised that a good half are like, yeah, well, you know, we'll find something else because we've done that before. Our people have been through extreme climatic changes before. We'll weather this one too. So it's not all, it doesn't, this sort of indigenous, you know, like it doesn't necessarily go. You have to ask them because it doesn't necessarily go the same way you'd expect.
I think it might, some aspect might be about cultural barriers there, why they might not want to discuss that, because whoever's asking them might be expecting certain
answers.
Right, the same, you know, what they learn in the curriculum, and maybe the reindeer are not emphasized as much as you think. Right. So,
Well, and I'm a student, but one aspect could be too what they're experiencing at home. If their parents are recent immigrants, they may be more concerned with trying to fit into the local society and maybe leaving the old society behind.
Sure.
Okay, well, thank you, everybody. We have the room for plenty of time, so if you have other questions, you can.
I'll see you tomorrow.